Okay, this is David again. I just heard from somebody who'd watched the previous video over a dozen times, so that makes me pretty motivated to go and do this one. Okay, I have a slide here for you. I'm going to give you another angle on what I talked about last time, and of course we're just going to continue with examples and discussions and more points and so forth. So I just shifted to this slide from before about saying what the shift was, but now I'm going to do another angle on this shift, and then of course we'll continue to discuss these kind of long sentences on this slide that I've broken up into three parts and put some thoughts in bold. It's going to give us a starting point for discussing. It's not that necessarily reading this will make perfect sense unless you sort of already get it, and then it might make sense. But let's go here. So I wrote on this slide that it's another description of the fundamental shift that I'm trying to get to in this series. All right. So I wrote how, when, and why. So I guess this isn't actually a sentence, probably. I could have said it is and then made it a sentence with those two words. But anyhow, I wrote how, when, and why. Sorry, let me just interrupt. I will. If I had just said, instead of it is, the shift is, right? So we could insert that in our minds. The shift is how, when, and why to use constructed thoughts, right? So we're going to have to investigate what that means, constructed thoughts, right? Constructed thoughts to think about and what I'm about to say here is pretty similar to like the stuff of consciousness, the stuff that you're conscious of, or what I've previously referred to as your consciousness screen, all right? So I'll read again. How, when, and why to use constructed thoughts to think about your immediate sensory experience and your internal mind as distinct from fabricated assumptions about the external world. All right. So now I've read the whole sentence. And now we, of course, need to delve into what the heck I'm talking about here. So the entire world pretty much operates in a default worldview that people are unaware of. It's kind of the only thing, except for I'm talking about an alternative to what otherwise is the only way that people understand how to think and how the world is and so forth. And people don't actually realize how to think in such a way that they're not bringing in these fabricated assumptions about the external world into their thinking. We need to be able to think about what we could call the world of seems. Okay, this middle line here on this slide when I wrote to think about your immediate sensory experience and your internal mind. This is like the world of how things seem to you. We need to be able to think at that level. I had a discovery actually decades ago where I realized when I was trying to figure out, well, what do we know? Like, what can we base logic on top of or off of? Because logic by itself wasn't really working for people. Even though we as humanity or as individual people have some sense of how logic is supposed to work, it isn't really practically used in a way that everyone can just sort of talk to each other logically and figure out the same common truths, right? There's something that's like not working about logic. And generally people's way of dealing with that is to just basically blame other people, right? And say, well, it's the other person. They're too emotional, or they're immoral, they're bad, they're of the other worldview, they're the wrong political party, wrong religion, right? They're sinful, or they're idiot Christians, right? However we do it, we basically figure that the reason logic isn't working is other people are screwing it up, right? But the trouble with that is it doesn't really work, right? Like it doesn't bring us together and help us figure out truth, right? Let on whatever group you pick, whether it's Democrats, Republicans, conservative, liberals, Christians, some other religion, or atheist, deconstructionist, whatever, libertarians, right? Inside of those same groups, you'll have the same splinter problems, right? Inside of Protestantism or evangelicals, they'll disagree about a ton of things, right? So it can't always just be someone else's fault. There's something hidden that must be going on, right? Like I referred to in the last video, it's like we're missing something, right? Like something is wrong in some deep hidden way that we keep running into. Or else we can, of course, just not think this and just blame something, right? The problem is sin. The problem is people are not virtuous enough, right? That's what basically every pastor I ever talk to will say. I've never met a Christian pastor who's actually curious about understanding how to know what's true. They've figured it out, and the problem is people just aren't hearing God's voice. They're not Jesus's sheep, right? They're not virtuous enough. They're not studying the Bible diligently enough, like whatever it is. But there isn't really a problem other than what they've already identified, which is that people are sinful, people are flawed, et cetera, right? So they feel like they know what the problem is, and they're not interested in hearing about a real solution to a real identification of the real problem. So in essence, the problem is solved by blaming somebody else, or even blaming their own sinful nature, right? Even if they, say they're not perfect, right? It's a very Christian thing to say, oh no, I'm not perfect either, without really identifying anything specific about their current ideas, right, that are imperfect. It's just their conclusion is they're just not virtuous enough, right? And if we actually examine pretty much any success philosophy by any person of any philosophy or religion or non-religion or whatever, it mostly comes down to like do better, right? And gamer terminology, get good, right? It's a skill issue, right? Some form of, again, do better, be more virtuous without necessarily using the word virtue, right? But I am proposing a very different approach and very different solution. And in essence, one way of looking at the problem is that we need to learn to think about something we actually can know, something where we have some sort of direct experience, direct access, and somehow stop importing assumptions long enough to get some clear, accurate thoughts. I still live my daily life by operating on assumptions. But we need to have a separate, clean space and ability to think in a way that we're not making those same assumptions. There's a metaphor that I like to use of, let's say we go back to before microscopes were invented, right? I don't know when that was exactly, maybe 16 or 1700s. If I had to guess, and I haven't looked it up, but I would guess 1700s, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Anyhow, if we go back before that, and we invent a microscope, right? And we excitedly show friends and like, look what you can see. You can see in the water here, there are these microorganisms, right? And it opens up a whole new world to us. But if they were like, well, I don't see how I'm going to live my life if I go out tonight and I have this microscope in front of my face, right? You'd say, well, I actually wasn't suggesting that you always spend the rest of your life looking through a microscope, but it opens up a whole new world when we sometimes look through a microscope, right? Not that we always need to be doing that. However, if we do have a microscope and other people do not have a microscope, then we can understand that we have something that allows us to see something, right? And of course, the metaphor here is to what I'm showing you, this shift that I'm showing you, and this method that I'm describing to you. It's not arrogance if you have a microscope to think that you're aware of certain things that other people aren't, and that you can see certain things that other people can't see. It's not because you're just woke up or you're just better or you're smarter. You just have a tool that you clearly have that clearly works in a certain way, and that clearly gives you a way of seeing something other people aren't seeing, right? And that's a good analogy to what I'm showing you. You don't have to look through it all the time, but you can definitely understand that you have it, and it allows you to see things other people can't see without it. Not because you're better, they just don't have the tool. If they have the tool, they can see those things too. And you can understand that you do have this tool and that the tool works. And it's not just like all in your head, or it's not your arrogance, and you're not basically wrong about it. Okay. And it's not like your opinion that you have a microscope, if you have one, Okay, let's go to the next slide here. All right, let me just use an example because this stuff is kind of abstract right on the previous slide. Let's talk about the idea of an inerrant Bible, right? I am a Christian. I would love it if Christians would stop making so many mistakes. And one of many examples of mistakes that Christians make is not every Christian, but a lot of them and a lot of churches have a a bunch of things they're supposed to agree to, right? And you even have colleges, Christian colleges, where professors need to sign like a statement of faith, and one of them is often this: that the Bible is inerrant. Now, the issue with saying that the Bible is inerrant is, I'll illustrate it with a parallel first. If I pointed to a guy, like if we were in real life and I pointed to a guy somewhere, like in the same room, and I was like, see that guy, that guy's Joe, right? See Joe over there, and he's a married bachelor, right? And if you were to say, well, no, I don't know about anything about Joe, but I can tell you this: Joe is not a married bachelor. And if then I were to respond when you deny that Joe's a married bachelor, then I'm sure everyone follows this, but you understand that a married bachelor is an inherent contradiction, right? It can't exist. God can't even create a married bachelor because a married bachelor is no thing, right? That phrase points to no thing. It's just a nonsense phrase or an inherent contradiction. So it's not that a married bachelor is counterfactual, by the way. Something counterfactual would be like saying that Paris is not the capital of France or Barcelona is the capital of France. A counterfactual is not a contradiction. It's something that goes against a supposedly true fact, right? And if the fact really is true, then something against it would really be false if that was the case, right? Typically with facts, we can't 100% prove them through logic. But anyhow, back to the married bachelor. So if you were to deny that Joe's a married bachelor, and if I were to respond by saying, are you saying that Joe's married or not married? Right? Sorry, I should have put the word probably not in there to make more sense of this. All right. So if I were like, are you denying that Joe's married? Right. And so again, you can continue and say, no, I didn't say that Joe is not married. I said that no matter what Joe is, he's not a married bachelor. Right. If he's married, he's not a bachelor. If he's a bachelor, he's not married. So it's very important when I say that, when I deny that the idea of the Bible being inerrant, I'm actually not saying that the Bible contains errors. Okay, I'm not saying anything about that one way or the other at this point, right? Other people can discuss that. I don't really tend to talk about facts, believe it or not, right? That's because I have a different whole thing to teach about than discussing what facts are what, right? What things about the external world are correct or not is a separate type of thing. It's what most people talk about, but I don't really need to tend to discuss that. I'm not saying I'll never talk about something about the external world, of course. I'm sure you'll catch me doing that sometimes, but it's not my focus. So I don't have a problem. I'm not saying the Bible does or does not have errors. Just like I'm not saying, or you in this illustration wouldn't be saying to me whether Joe was or wasn't married. Just like, I don't know Joe, I don't know whether he's married, but he's not a married bachelor. That I know for sure. Okay, so an inerrant Bible cannot exist, right? It's a nonsense concept. Like words can't be inerrant, and certainly not on top of that, you're talking about something that is like translated both into other languages and even by someone that spoke the original languages, they would have their mind has to translate these written words into like meaning, right? Like no one suggests that you can just be near a Bible or just a Bible being anywhere across the world or close to you just emanates all of its meaning directly into your mind perfectly, right? That isn't what people are claiming. So the minute you're not claiming that, then what are you saying, right? Anytime, if we try to pin someone down, and let's go back to this previous slide. If we don't fabricate assumptions about the external world, then we could what we can learn to do is operate fully within the world of seems, right? Within the world of this middle phrase here, to think about your immediate sensory experience and your internal mind. What I mean by these odd phrases is let's talk about the Bible without assuming anything about the external world or some external Bible, and let's just try to identify in a world that we can directly access, right? Our world that we're immediately conscious of, a scenario, or just construct what is it you mean by that phrase in the first place and then we can try to figure out whether it's true or not, right? Because if we did that with Joe being a married bachelor, right? if someone's like, oh, well, I need to see the marriage certificate before I can analyze that, or I need to talk to Joe, they would be misunderstanding the nature of accurate thinking, right? We don't need to talk to Joe. We don't need to go look up online their marriage certificate or see it in real life. Or then if he produced it in real life, then discussing whether or not he faked it, right? We can go on and on forever with evidence about whether or not he's a married bachelor. But we don't need to do that, do we? Right? Because what I'm proposing overall to the world and in life and in these videos about this paradigm shift is there's actually a bunch of stuff we can figure out without going to the external world and looking around for facts and that whole sort of approach. We can figure out a whole bunch of stuff without any of that. So let's do that first, and let's get all that straight ideally among the people close to us, and then among everyone in the world, ideally, where we're all straight on the things we can get straight on, where we're all like. There was kind of an interesting exchange I had with my best friend Mike years and years ago, and it had to do with this idea of like dogma and how it like his thought, which he came around on, and he kind of came to my position on long ago, to his credit. It's to anyone's credit if they end up agreeing with me, right? But seriously, his idea, which is a common and understandable one, being raised an atheist and so forth, was that, well, dogma causes wars, dogma causes like fights and oppression, right? But actually, I pointed out to him that at cash registers around the world, there generally are not fights, right? Like if you buy something that's $4.99 and you had someone a 10, right? They're going to generally give you $5.01 back, right? And that's extremely strong dogma across everybody, and it actually does not cause fights, right? So when we all understand something accurately and kind of have a good sense of why we understand it, and people actually don't fully understand why they understand math. If they did, they would understand lots of other things as well as they understand math. And sometimes people say, well, math, abstract things like math don't necessarily apply to the real world, or we don't know if they apply to the real world. Well, it turns out that in reality, we don't have a lot of fights at a cash register, right? Overwhelmingly, we can have agreement about those things. So yeah, it really does apply to the external world and to real life. And getting it straight will get rid of a lot of fights, right? There's things I can and will go over that will get rid of a ton of fights that married couples or any business, I didn't mean to say business, any two people in any kind of relationship have. They regularly have disagreements about things that they don't need to disagree with. It would be like, or it's the same type of thing as disagreeing about how much change to get after you buy something. It's unnecessary. It can be known, but it isn't. These things aren't known, but they can be, right? And when they can be, we're just way better off. And this right here, in my fictional example here, my scenario I've made, is an example of something where we don't need to go to the facts. We can figure it out in the world of seems. All we need to do is to understand together, right? You and me, if we were in this situation where I was saying Joe's a married bachelor and you're saying I'm sure he's not. And in order to educate me, right, or show me, help me understand that Joe is definitely not a married bachelor, all we would need to do is to construct meanings in our world of seems, like using scenarios, what married means and what bachelor means. And we wouldn't need to define these words in terms of other words, because that could kind of go on forever, right? Or lead to confusion. What we could do is construct an idea of marriage. And I talked last video about this I use a kind of metaphor of like clay, right? What happens is when we're talking to each other or when we're thinking for just ourselves, then we'll use kind of words, pictures, whatever we use, but we'll have these concepts. But what we want to do is learn to treat these concepts kind of like clay with a bit of shape. If we were talking about a pig, for example, right? then um, we we have a kind of sense of what pig means. But if we wanted to construct the meaning for the sake of a precise conversation, then it isn't that we would need to define it in terms of words. What we would want to do is identify some characteristic of what we mean by a pig, or even some phrase, and just say, all right, this is our working idea. And then we can adjust it or hone in on it. And then whenever we come up with something that we're satisfied with, then that's the one and only logical, necessary definition of pig. I know I'm not getting more and more into the example and giving like precise words about what a pig might be, but I'll just continue without doing that for the moment. When we come up, and the same thing could be for God, all right, the idea of God. Once we do come up with an idea of what God is, for the sake of our discussion, for the sake of our constructing in a scenario, right, or at the level of seems, how things seem, then we need to keep that still, but we can propose changes. We might continue to discuss about God or about a pig and say, well, wait a second, hold on. I left out that it has to be a mammal, or I left out that it has a stomach, right, as part of my literal logical definition, right? And if I do define a pig as a mammal that has a stomach and whatever else I give to it, then that is the literal exact definition for the sake of our discussion. And any other things that we add to that would have to be characteristics that we somehow discover. Or we could think of another characteristic and say, let's actually add that onto our logical definition, right? That is part of our definition of pig. And what that means is anything that doesn't fit that full exact definition that we've constructed for the sake of our conversation is not a pig for the sake of our discussion. And anything that does fit, like if I accidentally give a definition of a pig that can also, a cow can fit into it, then either a cow is in fact a pig for the sake of our discussion, or we need to adjust our definition of pig and acknowledge that we're doing so that it's distinct from a cow, right? And it might be that we don't need to have a very precise definition of a pig at all in order to have a discussion about pigs, right? Because only certain characteristics of a pig might matter. If we say like, well, we need to think how many pigs we need for our banquet, right? And we think like, all right, it's going to be about 20 people can eat from one, out of one pig, right? If that's the case, and if it's the case that realistically we're not going to go to the store and confuse a pig with a cow when we go to the store, then we're fine. That's all we need. But if we're having a discussion in which the very small nuances between a pig and the next closest animal become very relevant, then we need to get more clear about how we're defining a pig for the sake of that discussion. All right. Similar with God, right? If we were to prove that there is a thing in existence that is conscious and is unlimited in knowledge and power and creates everything we're aware of at every moment, then we would probably be pretty comfortable saying, all right, well, that's God, right? If there was only one of those things and nothing anywhere near close to that type of thing in existence, right, then we could feel comfortable calling that God. Now, if I defined God that way in terms of the word, just defined it, then that would be the meaning of the word God in our discussion. Of course, it wouldn't prove that such a thing exists in reality by simply defining it. But if I were to separately prove it, right, then I've proven that that thing existed. We can call it anything we want, right? You can put any word you want to a concept for the sake of your discussion, right, and for the sake of your thinking. Of course, you can't say this is what the word means for society at large, right? I can't tell you what a word means to you, but I can tell you I can define a word and construct it for the sake of our conversation. If you say, no, it doesn't mean that, then I would stop and say, well, hold on. We're misunderstanding fundamentally how thought works. If you're saying that word doesn't mean what I'm saying it does, I'm only saying what it means for the sake of me talking about right now. But if you just object socially to me using that word, I'm willing to certainly use a different word for the concept I just built. You see, that's how I operate. That's just an example of how things happen in my worldview. Right? There's no such thing as someone saying, no, that word can't mean that. Right? Any word can mean anything, and of course it's inconvenient. Right? If I were to put weird words that don't normally work with concepts that they don't normally match with, it would become an impossible memory task, right? Or we'd have to write them all down and refer back to them, right? To be doing like some kind of weird puzzle. So I, of course, try to find words and phrases that most closely match what we would, normally think of, right, for that concept. But technically speaking, we can put any word to any concept. And there's no such thing as like the word is wrong. What's wrong is to construct one meaning of a word and then think or act or talk outside of that construction, right? Like that association between that word and that meaning. But we need to learn to do something in addition to just defining a word in terms of other words, because other words are going to be inherently blurry, right? We need to build off of a world of seams. I haven't prepared this in my head, but off the top of my head, if we were trying to come up with, okay, what does married mean, right? And we would try to just, we might start with a sort of backdrop. Okay, there's men and there's women. And if someone says, but wait a second, there's some people are neither a man nor a woman, or it's something people can choose to be one or the other. I'd say that's perfectly fine if that's the case in real life. I'm going to construct right now a scenario. I'm not asserting that this scenario matches real life. I'm going to construct something. And if you have an objection to what I'm constructing, there's no such thing as an objection. You can just have like a modification or a clarification or something like that. If an objection that what I'm saying doesn't match real life is a non-objection because I'm not claiming it matches real life, right? I'm only operating in the world of seems right now. Okay. Again, that phrase, I'm only operating in the world of seems, might not make perfect sense to somebody else. I get that. But I'm trying in this video and in this series to make it make sense slowly but surely. All right. So in the world of seems, again, let's suppose there's men and there's women, and they can choose to and again, you don't have to be that precise here. The precision only matters once it matters. So I don't need to be perfectly precise ahead of time. I don't need to say, wait, do these people have 5 fingers or not? Or even what is the exact nature of the contract when they get married, right? They form some agreement that's going to maybe involve something like they're going to stay together for their lives and not be with other people romantically or sexually, and and that can matter for identifying whose kids or what, but whatever. So they're going to enter into some agreement. They're going to call it being married. If it matters, we can get into the details of that agreement, but it might not matter for the sake of this discussion, right? Because a bachelor would then be a man that has not entered into a contract like that, whatever it might be, you see. So again, you notice how we don't need to get into the details of the contract. We just have a guy who, whatever that contract is, we can just picture it like it's a little thing on paper, right? And it says marriage contract and they sign it. We don't care what's on that contract for the sake of figuring out a married bachelor. A bachelor is someone who has not signed or verbally agreed to one of those agreements. And a married person is a person who has agreed to one of those agreements. So you cannot at the same time be both. So Joe can't be a married bachelor. If I say he's not a married bachelor, I'm just identifying that phrase refers to nothing. I do not know, or you do not know, whether you're not asserting whether or not Joe's married. Okay? So now, if we do this, so hopefully that illustrated pretty well. So if we do the same thing with the Bible, if we identify what the Bible is, right? And if someone says, well, it is a set of words, right? Well, a set of words can't, in my understanding, be inerrant, right? And then someone will say, well, the original meaning of the words. Okay, so the Bible is not the words now. The Bible literally does not consist of words according to that person's very definition, right? Does that make sense? Like the original intent of the Bible, that phrase, the original intent of the Bible, that intent is not words, as I understand words. Now, we can continue with this discussion if someone wanted to assert, no, the intent matched up precisely with actual words and inherently carried intent perfectly, right? Then I would need to start delving into more concepts like what is a word, right? And if they were to define words in such a way that that allowed for intent to be literally the same as words, then we can go on from there, right? But it would turn out that that meaning of word would probably would be different and incompatible with our normal understanding of words, right? Or with like words on a page, right? Or the actual Hebrew words that normally people would think would make up part of the Bible, right? The Bible is made up of, as I understand it, different languages in the original, such as Greek and Hebrew. But again, original intent, like in like say God's mind, right? I agree that ideas in God's mind can be inerrant, right? I don't know what an error would look like in terms of an idea that God would have, right? To have an error, you're basically holding a contradiction in your mind. I don't think God can hold a contradiction in God's mind and like not be aware of it or whatever, or uphold the truth of both sides of a contradiction in God's mind. I don't think God can do that. I'm quite clear. When I say I don't think, I would assert that I'm clear. I understand perfectly and accurately that God cannot do that, and will not do that, and would not do that, etc. So again, if we have words as I would generally understand it, then inerrant is a nonsense concept, right? Because if we hone in, but then they might say, no, it is inerrant. Well, okay, so we need to construct the meaning of inerrant, right? We don't just define it, right? No errors, right? Of course, if you just define something with words and then define words with words, I can look at the dictionary definition of Bible maybe and dictionary definition of inerrant, and those are both so blurry that I can hold them both in my mind, no problem. Right? We can hold a contradiction in our mind. A person can genuinely believe that Joe could be a married bachelor. Right? You do that by not being distinct about married and not being distinct about bachelor. Right? I can picture Joe as a married bachelor. I can picture 10 married bachelors in a room and 2 of them leave and now there's 8 married bachelors left, right? I do that by, again, having blurry concepts in my mind that aren't clear, right? And again, that's how we come up with an inerrant Bible. It just feels good and right to people. But if we were to continue and have a discussion or hone in on it, we would. Of course, I can't prove it to you. These things you can only prove to, like in a certain sense, to yourself or understand for yourself. I could keep going and talking about this example, but I'd rather move on, where I kind of gave more thoughts about how inerrant might be honed in on and how Bible might be honed in on. But at least I gave an indication of why, of why I understand it to be an inherent contradiction. And 100% of every Christian I've ever talked to, when I try to understand what they mean by an inerrant Bible, they cannot tell me. And I don't mean that they can't prove me wrong. Of course, like that's a way higher standard. Okay. What I'm saying is they can't even like explain it or define what they themselves mean. Not even like really a good try. I haven't even had one person like give a good attempt at it. They really cop out like super duper fast. And overwhelmingly, they tell me that because of 2 Timothy, the Bible says that the Bible's inerrant, and that's good enough for them, and that proves it, which is pretty extraordinary to me. Like, do you want other people to come to, have a relationship with Christ, turn to Christ rather than themselves, and so forth? If so, why would you stop at something that obviously weak? Right? A book, right? Because the meta of that, the structure of that logic or argument is there's a book, and in that book says that it's true. And it's not even nearly that good, right? You have a letter written by some person something like 100 years after Jesus that apparently doesn't look like it was from even Paul, but that doesn't matter if it's from Paul or not, right? If Paul wrote to someone, all scripture is God breathed, which doesn't even mean inerrant as I understand it. But that's a fact which doesn't really matter because I'm not about arguing facts, right? So who wrote it when doesn't really matter. What matters to me is that even in the world of seems, if I get a Christian to express to me what the Bible is, right? It's 66 collection, like sets of writings, which we can call books, right? I wouldn't normally call something as short as some of these things a book, but in the terminology for the Bible is there's 66 books, right? And again, I'm not asserting this as a fact. I'm saying that if I have a discussion with a Christian, and again, I'm a Christian as well, but if I have a discussion with a Christian and they tell me, right, they will say, yeah, it's a 66 books, and and that Second Timothy was written at a time when not all of the books had even been written by their own belief system. Like they'll construct a scenario, right, for themselves and say, yeah, right, I agree to this. This is my worldview, is that there were 66 books, and when like the 52nd book was written, then it said that all scripture is God breathed, right? Whatever that means, or whatever they intended by meaning that. Um, I think it's pretty obvious, and if someone wants to disagree, that's fine, okay. But that they were referring to the Jewish scriptures, which, by the way, are not even the same thing as the Old Testament, which is a little odd because now if they're inerrant, we're talking about things that are not even included in the Bible, right? Um, I think it's reasonably uncontroversial to say that the writer of Second Timothy was referring to something other, like the Jewish scriptures at the time, and so like generally in most Christians' worldview, that's pretty obviously what they were referring to. Christians wouldn't even necessarily disagree with that; they just kind of start evading, and their mind just kind of kicks up a real subconscious fuss for them, and they come up with stuff. I'll ask my pastor, right? Or I'm sure there's this or there or this is what tradition says. Just kind of random speak at that point. And that's my 100% across the board experience. Of course, outside of you guys, and like there's plenty of Christians that out there that are kind of interested in thinking accurately, but in practice, I don't really run into them like in my normal life. I kind of meet them through doing this, right? But when I actually talk to people, then it's an interesting experience talking about this. And I care about it because I care about Christianity, right? I care about people knowing about God, and this is getting in the way of people doing that. But again, I don't make arguments. What I want is for people to understand how to think accurately. Now, the next thing I wrote on the slide is what about faith, right? So what people will say, well, David, I just have faith. Faith is the evidence of things hoped for, and the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things to come, or some such, right? Just again, there's, in my opinion, no better example of why you don't define words in terms of other words than this so-called definition of faith, right? But they'll just be like, well, I have faith. I know the Bible's inerrant because I have faith in that. Well, now, of course they won't generally do this, but if you hone in on what exactly is faith, right? Again, not assuming we're trying to figure out something out there in the external world, because we can't do that. Like it's like trying to push something you can't touch, right? Or right, like it's like if there's glass right between you and like between, like at a bank, right? There's like not glass, but like protective plastic or something, right? What is it called? Plexiglass or whatever. You can't touch right behind that. And so people will argue endlessly because they're trying to argue about like the real world, the external world. But we can never directly access that. We need to get our thoughts straight where we can get our thoughts straight, right? That's my whole point of this whole shift, is to realize there's so much we can get right at the level of the world of seems, and that's actually the only place we can get things right. And it's going to have a ton of practical application in the external world. And I'll try to explain more about how that works in the future. But again, like the one characterization of the law of implication, which is the name of this channel and such, is begin with what you know and build properly from there. And literally, if you do that in life, then you will just keep building properly. You'll keep actually progressing. You'll keep moving things towards good, right? There's a lot in life we don't control, right? A ton we can't know and we can't control directly. If we try to deal with life, I'm about to say something very, very kind of useful and profound here. I don't say that to pat myself on the back. I say it, just so you can stop and kind of pay, like, of course you're paying attention in general, but kind of treat it seriously, write it down, whatever. I don't have this on a slide, but shoot. So what was I saying? So begin with what you know and build from there. There's so much, I remember now, there's so much we can't control, we don't know and control in life. If we try, generally people try to deal with life by getting the details right, okay? Perfectly nice to get the details right. I'm not saying you should get the details wrong, just like I'm not saying that, Joe is married, or not married, right? But what I'm saying is that getting the details right in life is kind of like a nonsense concept. It's impossible. It's like saying you should know everything, or you should even know the things that, like all these things that are even in your immediate life, but that you actually can't know and can't control, even though it might feel like you can control them or seem like you should know them. You still actually can't know them for sure. You can't know and you can't directly know and directly control really anything in the external world, believe it or not. And so by controlling, by understanding what you can in the world of seems, the world that you do have direct access to and direct power over, and I'll get more into exactly what you have direct power over soon. I'm not sure in this video, we're about out of time. But if I'll maybe just close this video with this complete thought here. So my fundamental approach to life, which I think over time if I haven't already, I think I can prove to you it is a knowably correct approach, is of course I try to get details right. Of course when I walk to Starbucks, I just try to walk to Starbucks, right? And I try to walk in the correct direction and get my stuff, right? Even though I don't know for sure it still exists and that every step on the sidewalk is going to actually land on solid ground and not fall to the earth, right? I don't know those things for sure. So of course I try to get details right, right? But my fundamental approach to life and my fundamental approach to business that made so much money and my fundamental approach to my marriage that did so well, and my fundamental approach to being a father with my son, which seems to be going quite well, is that I focus on the foundation and simple, right? Like, there's the idea, keep it simple, stupid, right? But what does that mean, right? What it needs to mean is foundations are weirdly simple because there's just less of it, right? There's just less you have to know and focus on and get right if you get the foundations right. So get the stuff we can know right, that once we make the right shift, it's simple, right? The shift can feel, I don't know, right? Like difficult or whatever to make. I'm sure when I first talked about the slide today, right? It's not like it makes perfect sense unless you already understand it to begin with, right? I just put the original slide here up. I get that. But this foundational approach to life, you have control. You actually have power and control over something. And the more you exercise that, it's not that you have more power, but you have more leverage in the place that's most effective, right? Like as you make this shift, it's like you can make money, for example, right? And you can get to know people, and that's helpful. That gives you more leverage, right? But the place that you're actually going to get leverage that gives you the most return, including return where you can build other leverage, right? Again, I built making money. I built having better relationships off of this fundamental leverage. So I'm all about those things, right? But build the primary, most foundational, and therefore most powerful and most reliable thing first. Prioritize this. Stick with me. I'll continue. We only make a certain amount of progress. I hope to have 3 or 4 more slides that I covered on this video in 20 minutes. Right? I went into this video thinking it might be half as long and cover more than twice as many slides. Right? But we'll just keep going and keep making progress. And it's so worth it, believe me. Thank you guys. I'll talk to you soon.